Today, we're going to be talking about what is sound versus what is unsound. And surprisingly, that can be applied to many different areas of our lives, including public policy regarding, say, what material should be accessible to children in a public library or a school library, as well as sound money versus unsound money. I've got the details coming up right after this.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Well, it looks like the Idaho legislature may be putting the final touches on this year's legislative session. And it's been an interesting one. There have been a lot of very hard-fought battles, not over issues that you would likely expect. For instance, this is one of the wins that I guess we can celebrate for what is sound policy. Scott Herndon informs us Idaho's governor has signed Library Bill H710. Now, this is an age verification bill. It's not a book ban. There's no books being taken out and burned, nor is it preventing anybody from buying whatever books where they want to. But there is a sexual obscenity law now that will go into effect in July that will prevent inappropriate material from being put in the hands of young children. Now, of course, to expect the press to report on this in a fair and honest way is probably asking a bit much, but they're very interested in this issue. Check out this headline from the Idaho Capital Sun. This is actually a guest commentary from Holly Cook. She spins it that Idaho legislators have villainized librarians for allowing freedom of speech to exist on shelves. Oh, was that the name of that bill? I thought it was something about keeping, the how-to books out of the hands of kids that was teaching them sexually deviant practices far beyond their years. Now, again, that doesn't ban these books. It just simply says you shouldn't make it available to kids in publicly accessible places. In other words, if they're age appropriate, people can still access this. But you have to wonder, why would these books be needed in the library in the first place? Let's take a look at how Holly spins this. First of all, she tells us the sky will, in fact, fall down. Chicken Little even rolled his eyes at the histrionics here. The reality, says Holly, is that after House Bill 710 becomes law, libraries will need to buy and install better camera systems and will likely need to hire IT people to review camera footage to obtain proof of how explicit books ended up in the children's section. Then, of course, those large video files will have to be retained because they're public records. That's very expensive, too. Libraries will have to buy these systems quickly, too, because the legislature declared an emergency exists, speeding up the time frame for which the new statute takes effect. Boy, that sounds pretty complicated, doesn't it? I mean, it's going to turn our libraries on their ears. But why isn't there a more obvious question of why should this stuff be accessible to children in libraries in the first place? And let's take it one step further, or let Holly take it one step further. She says, our libraries are cozy sanctuaries where Idahoans of any age, any background, and with any financial means can learn, grow, and find answers to nearly any problem. Yes, especially if that problem is how to perform deviant sex acts on yourself or someone else, and how to start down that dangerous and unhappy road of doubting that you were born in the right body and perhaps being seduced into taking permanent measures that cannot be reversed, whether it's puberty blockers or surgical mutilation. Yeah, libraries, without that, how would anybody know where to go? Okay, sarcasm off. She says the implementation of House Bill 710 threatens one of our most important community resources, wastes our tax dollars, and offends parents' right to govern our own children. In no way does this threaten a parent's right to govern their own children. How do we know this? Because parents can still access those books if that's what they want their kids to have. Now, I can't imagine a parent who is actually an involved parent wanting to force that on their kids, unless, of course, you're a celebrity. Isn't that kind of the thing now with celebrities? This is their purse puppy that they carry them. Well, I have 3 trans kids, and my neighbor over here has 2 trans kids. It's something that is very trendy. And it's sad because it's the kids who really seem to be the ones who get steered into this. And you have to question, are they really making their own decisions? Or is this kind of like the person who says, my cat is a vegan? Yeah, we both know who's making the decisions in that case. Nevertheless, parents should be in charge of their children. But at the same time, doesn't it seem a little bit fishy that if this stuff isn't accessible in the library, somehow we're doing a terrible disservice to people? No. All we're doing is saying if you're going to peddle that kind of smut to kids, you're going to have to go back to doing it the old-fashioned, clearly illegal way from a back alley or maybe in a windowless van. I don't know what these peddlers of this smut want to resort to, but they don't have the prestige and the respectability of a public institution like a public library to hide behind. This takes away that ability to put this out there in front of kids and then try to pretend that it's just something innocent. It's just, anybody would wonder about this kind of stuff. No, it's being pushed. And frankly, it's about time that somebody pushed back. My understanding is at least Idaho Public Radio is reporting that Governor Little said, I signed that stinking library bill. Yeah, he had to take a stand. I'm glad he did it. Just a shame that we had to drag him kicking and screaming before he would do it. Next, let's talk about sound money. Governor Little has vetoed SB 1314, which would be the state, and this is a misprint from Idaho Public Radio, investing in silver and gold. You don't invest in silver and gold. You purchase it as a commodity. Now, Little said the bill failed to take into account the many additional costs that will be borne by taxpayers for the storage, safeguard, and purchase of commodities such as gold and silver. Now, of course, this brought out some of the usual suspects were like, well, that's some of the worst stuff you could invest in. The return on investment is just horrible when you buy gold and silver. And that's a good way to tell people, I don't understand a thing about monetary policy or what money actually is. Silver and gold should never be seen as investments. In fact, I'm going to let Brian Parsons actually spell out the details for us here. He says, it's not the governor's job to invest public funds in growth strategies. And that's true. It's not. It's the job of the governor and the legislature to protect the value of the public's funds, including by diversifying in stable mediums like metals. In other words, it's a store of value. Now, why would somebody want to do that? We'll get to that in just a moment. Government bonds routinely earn the lowest returns of all interest-bearing funds, but they're seen as a stable hedge against volatility. But what happens when the money is actually losing purchasing power? That's the problem with fiat currency, and that is why precious metals like gold and silver actually can serve as a store of that value. And I can illustrate this, and I will here in just a few moments. First of all, let me just show you what it looks like. Reasonable storage fees for sound money, which, by the way, the storage facility that was proposed to be the repository for gold and silver, should some of those state funds be diverted into those commodities, they would provide it at cost. But hey, when it comes to shelling out $72 million for the governor's big business friends, yeah, he's all about that. So let's talk for a moment about what sound money is. First of all, we'll start with what it isn't. Fiat money is what we use today. Oh, I know, it's awesome, those green things in your wallet and, those electrons that you see on your phone screen or on your computer screen, that represents your money. But what you're talking about is a government-issued currency not backed by any physical commodity like gold or silver, but rather by the government that issued it. In other words, it's an IOU. It is based on the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, which I don't know if you've checked, but that full faith and credit seems a little bit wobbly these days. Now, to illustrate why gold and silver represent a store of value rather than a growth investment, consider this. This is from Citizens for Sound Money. In 1929, the price of a troy ounce of gold was $20. Not uncommon to find a $20 gold piece, 1 ounce gold piece. There are 32.15 ounces per kilogram bar, so that equals $6,430 for 10 kilograms of gold. As of April 8th, at 9:33 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, an ounce of gold was $2,344.90 per troy ounce. So 10 kilograms of gold, that'd be about $750,885.35. Now, the average home price in the USA in 1929 was $4,902. So 10K of gold would have got you a nice sized home. 10 kilograms of gold, that is. The average home price in the USA today is $412,095. 10 kilograms of gold would get you a very nice sized home today as well. So what happened? Why is the price so much more? It's not that gold has gone up in value. It's that the dollar has lost 99.14% of its purchasing power since 1929 due to the printing and expansion of the currency supply, which is easiest to do with fiat currency because if it's not backed by something tangible, you can make as much of it as you want. You can borrow as much as you want, create a bond, and we'll pay that back. Wink, wink. Our kids or their kids or maybe their children's children will pay it back. Think about that. Property values did not go up by 840%. The dollar lost that much purchasing power in 95 years. Now, that shouldn't scare you into running out and buying silver and gold, but at least understand that as far as protecting those taxpayer funds, and this is not saying put everything on red and let it ride. This was just suggesting that the governor ought to consider doing that. This is being done in other states. It's not a big problem. But the faith that some people have in this fiat system, which opens the door, by the way, to a digital currency, particularly a central bank digital currency. The key here is digital. If it is a centralized currency and it is controlled by the money power, much like our fiat currency is today, think about what happened to the Canadian truckers or people who donated to the Canadian truckers just a couple of years ago. Bank accounts frozen, money seized from their accounts. People who donated in good faith, to their cause, had their money seized and then donated to an appropriate charity, whatever that means. It means you don't have control over that money. Doesn't that seem like something that could be abused, especially with a central bank digital currency? Doesn't it seem like some kind of social credit score would at least be a possibility, if not a reality as quick as the power seekers and opportunists could make it one? Maybe a road we don't want to go down. Definitely something to think about. All right, moving on. Maybe you've heard the follow-up to the Hyde hoax of the alleged racial attack in Coeur d'Alene. That's kind of dropped. Apparently, nobody could find a lifted white pickup or a couple of pickups flying Confederate flags that were accused of hurling a racial slur. There was a blurry picture of a silvery-looking car, but it was pushed and pushed and pushed as, see, this is evidence that we have much more work to do on racism. And then, predictably, here comes the next crisis. Okay, let's move on to the next new thing. Now the Department of Justice has charged an 18-year-old young man, Alexander Mercurio, in Coeur d'Alene, with providing material support to ISIS after at least 3 CHSs, that's confidential human sources, provocateurs, spies working for the government, and an undercover agent helped him plan attacks on churches before the FBI arrested him. There's a picture of him posing with a flag given to him by a confidential human source and taken by a confidential human source. If you're starting to detect a pattern here, wait a minute. So the government came in and suggested this plan to him, supplied him with these things, and then when he nodded his head, okay, I'll do it, they arrested him. Well, congratulations. The Department of Justice has saved us from another monster that they created. I'm sorry, it's happened too many times. The Houterie militia in Michigan, the supposed plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, it just keeps going on. January 6th, more and more we're starting to learn that there were, in fact, people acting on behalf of the feds, undercover, of course, so we can't talk about that, but trying to encourage people to do questionable, if not illegal things. I guess this is one of those cases where the supply of crime or the supply of hate is outpacing, or the demand rather is outpacing the supply. So they have to make up these problems and then solve them, in their own way. It seems pretty ridiculous, but that's what's happening. So if you wonder why is there so much focus on this, well, here's a video that I would really encourage you to find. If you search up Gavin O'Blennis, he is a contracting officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. He openly talks about this, not realizing he's being filmed, talks about entrapping Americans, targeting Alex Jones, talks about 20 undercover FBI agents working the Capitol on January 6th. And he says, we can kind of put anybody in jail if you know what to do. You set them up. In fact, he says, we call it a nudge. Gives a little nudge in the right direction and just let them take a step and then, oh, look, we got our man. How can you trust a government that would send these kind of people in the name of national security out there to create crimes where none previously existed? And not just any crimes. If we're talking Northern Idaho, it's hate crimes. Idaho Leaders United. Well, we have an important thread here on Twitter about why hate crime legislation was needed back in the 80s or whenever it was enacted and why we need it now. It's not about solving actual racial problems or racial, denigration of another person. The reason they push the race baiting is to give them a reason to have legislation by which they can exercise control over your speech. Slurs and racism are bad, but you never sacrifice your freedom, and you certainly don't buy into the idea that just because somebody, Krista Hazel, I'm looking your direction, is outraged about something somebody else said, that we are all obligated to share in her outrage. That is cheap virtue signaling. And the thing you need to remember is just because someone is indignant That's not an accurate measure of their integrity. And you have no obligation to join in their indignation. More often than not, that's what they're telling you. Well, if you don't denounce this the same way that I do, then you're in question and you are reprehensible. No, that's the move of a control freak. And that's a control freak who needs to be rejected, and quickly. All right, let's end on a positive note. This is a column from Brian Allman in the Gem State Chronicle. I thought this was especially good. He asks, what is your focus, or where is your focus, rather? Are you focused on the latest, greatest outrage? Because a lot of people are kind of conditioned to look for, well, here's, what's everybody upset about? Here's what Brian says. He says, surviving in this information-drenched world means being able to separate the signal from the noise. Just because something's trending on Twitter, or for that matter, the lead story on the evening news, doesn't mean it's necessarily worth your time or mental energy. You have to ask yourself, are you a spectator watching the news for entertainment, or are you an activist who's working to change your community and your nation? Now, that's a question you have to answer for yourself. But Brian says, I don't want to be a mere spectator. He says, there are many issues that compete for my attention, but I have chosen to be deliberate about my focus. He says, I want to write about the issues that directly affect our communities and our state while letting others cover the rest. So he says, I don't need to write about the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum or the vaccine or what George Soros had for lunch. I would rather focus on the structure of the Idaho Republican Party, which is on the vanguard of politics in Idaho, issues that affect our day-to-day lives, and the men and women who will be making the decisions that set the course of our state for generations to come. And that is exactly why he is one of the best sources of information as to not only what's going on in the legislature, but what else is happening throughout the Gem State. Highly recommend that you subscribe to the Gem State Chronicle or his Gem State Substack. Brian does a remarkable job. I'm probably making his head swell up now because I'm heaping the praise on him. But really, he does a very even-handed job of doing it. And there is no agenda to keep you in the dark or keep you feeling guilty. So you have to think this way, you have to do that way. It's all based on sound policies versus unsound policies. And he does a dang fine job of exposing those unsound policies, which is one of the reasons why he and the Idaho Freedom Foundation catch a pretty fair amount of heat. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Bias, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in